Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host today, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I figure what better way to close out the year than doing a review for a Jean-Claude Van Damme classic in Sudden Death. This is easily one of my favorite Jean-Claude Van Damme films of all time. I love this movie. I love this movie so much. And the thing is that I do remember when this movie had come out, which actually came out back in December 22nd, 1995. So this year marks the 27-year anniversary of this film release. But I do remember seeing like a trailer and some commercials for it on TV. And as much as I did want to see the movie, I just never really actually went out of my way to go look to find the film in theaters or watch it in theaters, I meant to say. And I remember at the time too, when I had looked into the reviews, that a lot of people were saying that this movie is basically a ripoff of Die Hard, where this is just basically Jean-Claude Van Damme's version of Die Hard, which was nowhere near as good as Die Hard. Well, I do remember at the time thinking like, well, that sucks, but it never deterred me to want to check out the film. But again, I just didn't have that incentive to actually go out of my way to look for the movie. But it wasn't until I'm going to say maybe 2, 3, 4 years later, if I recall correctly, where the movie came across, I think on Cinemax or HBO. I really don't remember which one of those channels it was, but it was somewhere on TV. And when I saw the movie, I loved it. And I just remember at the time thinking, yes, you can clearly tell this is pretty much a carbon copy of Die Hard, but I still thought it was a very good film. And I would even go as far, and I don't know, people will consider it being as blasphemous, but this is actually, in my opinion, if you want to look at like some of the better versions of Die Hard films that have come out since Die Hard, this movie easily matches in the same level as Die Hard. Maybe not with the same budget per se, but it definitely did have the same impact that the Die Hard film had in various ways, with the exception of the fact that where Bruce Willis had the quirkiness about him as John McClane, in this case, Van Damme doesn't necessarily have that at all. He pretty much more or less plays a straight man, if you will, when it comes to him being more or less the everyday hero, if you will, which I actually thought was in a lot of ways was much more realistic in those terms when it comes to relating to him in that respect. Whereas John McClane, I'm not saying that we don't relate to him, but you definitely do have that fun factor about him where you actually like him a lot because he's funny as along the way as he kills people and ends up saving the day, whereas Van Damme has none of those quirkiness about him, but still has a wonderful attribute about him being a hero that we can all relate to and want to support and see become victorious at the end of the film. So there's a lot of great qualities about this movie that I certainly did have taken away that I still enjoy to this day. But, I'm going to point out, too, that this is not a perfect film by any means. But even though with the imperfection of this film, I think those imperfections do help out with the movie, at least from my perspective, where a lot of the flaws that you see in the movie actually made the film that much more enjoyable for me personally, that they actually made me like the film that much more, believe it or not. So I will definitely get into the plot synopsis here. And considering that, this is a Van Damme movie, there's nothing here that I could actually reveal that will actually ruin the film for you, because you already know at the end of the day, he's going to save the day, save his children, and defeat the bad guy. So I don't think that's going to ruin the experience here for you. I might not reveal certain things along the way, just in case if you haven't seen it, which I'm pretty sure if you have seen it, or if you haven't seen it, that you're still going to figure out along the way what actually happened along the way to reveal certain aspects of the character's a journey that actually helps you keep invested with the overall story here. But otherwise, I'll get into the plot synopsis, then I'll get into my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. Ex-fireman Darren McCord has a new job working security at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. Hoping to impress his kids, he scores tickets to the Stanley Cup Finals, unaware that the place has been taken over by a group of terrorists. Ex-CIA agent Joshua Foss is holding the vice president hostage in a press box and plans to blow up the building if he doesn't pay the ransom. But when Darren learns of his schemes, he jumps into action to save the day. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive of the film is with the overall story that we follow in this film, with the characters of Darren McCord, along with his children, the villain, and the various other people we come across throughout this film. Because, the one thing that I can point out about this film that really kept me invested with the story is truly with the characters. Because the action sequences, although there are a lot of fun, which I'll get into in a little bit here, that's not really what sells the film, because I think if it wasn't for the characters' journey and having that emotional attachment to them, I don't think the film would have worked as well, nowhere near as well as I think that is, as far as what it's set to accomplish here, that certainly had won me over in the repeat viewings I've had of this film since I first saw it over 20 years ago. But the one thing I will point out too of this film is that, for me personally, the one thing that really does sell the film has to do with the children. And of course, the other things are along the way too, which I'll get into here. But the children in this film, in this case, the son and the daughter, those two actors, in my opinion, make the story, because when you have the children in this film being in danger, there are a lot of qualities we've seen before with when you have a brother and sister relationship presented in movies, where you have the two siblings that, you know, they still love each other, but they're always at odds with one another. It's just the standard, you know, brother sisterly banter, if you will. That's still very much in the movie too, and usually that's kind of annoying in a lot of ways when it comes to how that gets presented in the movie, because it's a routine that we've seen before over and over and over again. And this film does not offer anything new in that respect. But what it really does very well, in my opinion, is how those children deliver those performances, especially when it comes to those emotional beats that comes with the film, that makes you become more invested with the story. At least that's how I felt for me when it comes to being invested with their particular story here. Because in the movie, when you come to find out that McCord was actually a firefighter in the beginning of the film, there's an event that occurs that eventually makes him go into security after this horrific event that occurred in the beginning of this film. You come to find out that he is someone that was very well respected in the fire department, and someone who's actually very well respected in the community. And then for him to go from being a firefighter to a security guard, that in a lot of ways kind of just downgrades in a lot of people's eyes, where he's like, well, you were a respectable man in this position, all of a sudden you're going to be a security guard changing light bulbs for the stadium and whatever else. It's kind of frowned upon in a lot of people's eyes, and including in this case with his son. Whereas his daughter, on the other hand, has no idea that her father is no longer a fireman, and still thinks of him as a hero and someone that she really looks up to and has a lot of respect for. Where the son, on the other hand, is always fully aware of the fact that he's no longer a fireman, and is kind of embarrassed by the fact that his father is now a security guard, where he was a very well-respected man in that community. So for him to go from that to this, he has a little slight embarrassment about the whole thing. But you can tell that even though he's slightly embarrassed of his father's career path, if you will, that he still very much loves and cares for him and does respect him too. But clearly it's obvious that he's more or less the rebellious one, if you will, out of the two siblings. But when you come to find out that as the story progresses along the way, the tension starts to build up, the actors, in this case with the two children, they start to deliver some really strong performances, where in a lot of ways, if it had not worked out at all in terms of them delivering some of these really believable and powerful performances, in those instances where it's required to have these characters show fear and show the having that balance between, you're annoying to me, in this case to the sister, but I'm sorry at the same time, and I fucked up. Like all those little subtle things about those little deliveries and comes in the performances, they've done a really good job in showcasing that in the film, where when you see the consequences of their said actions, you realize that there's a lot of weight behind it here too. In a lot of ways, it's not something to just be annoying for the sake of being annoying, but rather it's just the attributes of these characters that had developed for them to behave that way from what had occurred previously, the events of the film that led up to that moment there. So there's a lot of layers to those instances that I think certainly helped out to add weight to those moments, so that when you have those emotional beats, if you will, when it comes to those characters delivering those, or these actors, say, delivering these performances, you see that there's a lot of investment on their part, as well as for me as an audience member to be invested with what they're going through, and understand the motivation, understand why they made these decisions, whether they're good ones or bad ones, but you understand the reasons for that, and it actually makes you understand the overall picture at the end of the day. And I think a lot of it, like I said before, is done by these actors here doing a really good job and doing their due diligence to set the standard, if you will, with that part of the story, for you as an audience member to be invested as well too. I do know that there are some people who felt like the kids' performances weren't all that great. It's just very standard stuff, nothing new. I do agree in that sense, where this is nothing new in that respect. But as far as the delivery of the performances are concerned, they've done some top tier level stuff, in my opinion, that really kept me invested with the overall story. And without them, in my opinion, who are the secret ingredient to the whole story, I don't think I would have had the same emotional impact as well too. One thing I also want to point out is that there's actually a remake of this movie called Welcome to Sudden Death, which stars Michael Jai White, who I'm also a big fan of as well too. And he's actually worked with Van Damme once before in Universal Soldier 2: The Return, which was not a very good film. But the thing is that I was excited about this movie when it was announced that he was doing the remake, and the story is virtually the same, except this time around, instead of a hockey game, it's a basketball game. But the point is that The one of the major issues that I had with the film, because I actually did a review for this movie along with David Escascato, I think last year, if I recall correctly, and I did not like the film at all. In fact, I thought the movie was so terrible in that one of the biggest issues I had with the film is that there was no emotional attachment at all with any of these characters that were following her. Even though Michael Jai White is a really good actor and he does a good job with his performance in the film, but it's not his best film at all. In fact, I would consider it to be one of his worst films. But the major issue that I had with the film as well too is that when it came to the children, the same investment that I had with the children in Sudden Death, I didn't have any of that at all with this particular movie as far as Sudden Death is, Welcome to Sudden Death is concerned, because the things that were cliche in terms of the brother and sister banter, if you will, is very much in that movie too. But it definitely just it's quite, there's no emotion behind that as far as like me wanting to be invested with those characters, because it had in a lot of ways, I hate to say it like this, but it was a lot of empty calories for me, where it just didn't do anything for me at all, and which is a shame, because I'm not going to say that they were great in the role, the children, as far as I'm concerned. They definitely did their job well enough, considering with what they were giving, what they were working with her, and how the story is, you know, how the story was paced and how the story was presented, if you will. It worked in those aesthetics, but it just didn't do anything for me emotionally at all, where I honestly didn't really care for anybody in that movie at all. But in this film, on the other hand, the children are really what will set the tone for the film as far as the investment you get with the overall story, because you understand the motivation that the father has, because clearly the children are different in terms of how they look at their father, but they still very much love him and care for him. And the father, on the other hand, you can clearly tell he's someone that wants to be a part of his children's life, because when he meets up with his kids in the beginning of the movie, you see that he's no longer with his wife, and that his wife, or ex-wife in this case, does not want to be around him, and she has these standards about, you can see the children under my terms during the scheduling here, and you can't just show up out of nowhere and just randomly pick them up whenever you feel like it. So there's clearly a lot of tension along as far as where his relationship is with his ex-wife and where he's at in his life as well too. And to see that very early on, and then have the story progress along the way, where hey, I got these tickets for the kids to go see the game while I'm working there. I'm sure they would love to see that, and I just want to be around them. And then she relents and said, okay, fine, we'll go ahead and do that here. So there's a lot of great motivating factors about having these investments with these characters and see the motivations along the way. So, you know, I kind of went off on a tangent with that here too, but that's really the one thing I want to point out, is that the overall story that we're following here has to do with the characters, primarily with how the children, the actors, in this case, the kids, deliver the performances to keep you invested with the overall story. And Van Damme, in my opinion too, as I said earlier, he's not the guy who's playing the quirky John McClane type of guy. He's the polar opposite of that, and which I think worked well in his favor for the movie too, as far as like not being a full replica of Die Hard, because he's not doing that, but it really does play more or less the straight man, if you will, that in that sense, as far as, I wouldn't say as reality is concerned, but definitely to the point where like that's more relatable than John McClane, if you will, if that makes any sense. But I hope you understand where I'm coming from with that. But as far as the villain's concerned in Powers Boothe, this is another secret to get into this movie too, because Powers Boothe is one of those amazing character actors who's known for playing a lot of villainous roles, and he's really good at them as well too, because he definitely has the face, the voice, and that because he's a tall guy too, if I recall correctly, but he didn't have like that big physical aspect about him like he did, like Van Damme does. So he's not someone you can look and say, oh, he can fuck Van Damme up in a hand-to-hand combat, although they do have that in this movie. But he definitely has this menacing presence about him, where you just know that this guy is a threat immediately. And the one thing about this character is that where John McClane was that funny, quirky guy, still very much dangerous, that's what this villain is, where he is basically the polar opposite of Van Damme's character, where he's still very much a threat, but it has this likable aspect about him too, where you feel comfortable around him, but like that, he can just turn on you and have your head cut off in a heartbeat. And you realize that this guy's still very much a threat, to not take him lightly at all whatsoever. And I think Powers Boothe does a really good job in doing so, because he actually has a lot of great one-liners, and they're not cheesy, at least from my perspective, by any means, but he delivers them in such a hilarious fashion that cuts the tension, and just like that, we get right back to the things, back into the swing of things, if you will, as far as like what the threat is really all about in this movie. So I think a lot of it has to do with how Powers is able to balance that out and adding that comedy element to it, but never taking away from the story along as well, to not make it seem out of place. The other thing I want to point out too is with the action sequence of this movie. They're not perfect by any means. This is definitely a heightened reality for sure, but it does work effectively. This is definitely more like an action adventure type film. There are some hand-to-hand martial arts in this movie as far as the fight scenes are concerned, but there's actually a lot less of that, and it's more just action adventure shootouts and swinging from one place to another and dismantling the bombs and so on and so forth. It's a lot of just more of an action adventure aspect rather than martial arts, which is I think one of the reasons why I think the film works so well in my opinion, because if Van Damme had done a lot more of those action hand-to-hand combat type of style fighting he does throughout most of his films, not to say that it's going to take away from the movie, but I think not doing that as much adds a little bit more reality to the film as far as the keeping the story much more grounded in that sense. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think the film worked very well, because it's still a Jean-Claude Van Damme film. There's no doubt about that, but it's a much more grounded film in my opinion in terms of his action films are concerned. And then, there's also some other things I want to point out too, which is it is considered to be a negative, but I think it actually works in favor of the movie, where the imperfection in some of these action sequences where you get to see that there's clearly a stunt double that's doing these stunts in these in certain sequences where it's not Van Damme. You can clearly see the guy's face. I actually thought that was hilarious. And as the years had gone by, it actually made me enjoy the film that much more. There's actually one part of the movie too where in the film where they're watching the hockey game, there's this big massive monitor where you see all the scores being displayed out there, and you can see the monitors as far as the games are concerned. That's going on at that moment, where Van Damme's character is swinging from that into one of the press boxes from here to there, if you will. And you can clearly tell that one is a stunt double doing the stunt, but you can also see that there's a harness behind the guy's head, if you will, that you can see that he has a vest on him underneath his shirt that's holding up in this position. And then he's going to hold on to this cable cord that's going to swing him from one place to another. Whereas in the movie, they would have removed all that, but for some reason that must have slipped through the cracks because it's still very much visible in the shot. And I actually thought that worked well in the favor of the film because, one, it was one of those little things about the inside baseball, if you will, that you can pick up on and how they actually pulled it off. That's still very much in the movie. And despite those flaws, I still enjoyed it. So, but as far as everything else is concerned, this is just an overall really good story that we're following here. And we have the time to spend with the characters and really get to know them along the way, where you get a lot of more or less exposition in the very beginning of the movie to understand where everyone's place is at in their life. And then along the way, you get to learn more about their motivation, understand who they are as under these stressful situations, especially when it comes to the villain, in this case with Powers Boothe, where you understand his motivation, whether you agree with him or not, but you get it. And in a lot of ways, he doesn't necessarily see himself as the bad guy because he knows that he has been wrong and he feels like he deserves this compensation, which he's asking for the reasons that he felt were necessary to point them out to the vice president, because he knows he's the one guy that can get the job done. So in setting the motivation for the villain, you get it and you understand it, and therefore you can see his reasons for why he's doing what he's doing, even though it's such an extreme fashion, but it's understandable. And in some ways you could almost sympathize with the guy. I wouldn't say that you feel bad for him, but you understand where he's coming from. So I think when it comes to the overall picture in itself, as far as how it's handled from start to finish, it is handled, in my opinion, quite masterfully under the direction of Peter Hyams, who I think is truly an underrated director. When you look at his films like Time Cop, and I'm going to even say is a movie that he directed too called End of Days, which is not the greatest action film I've ever seen, but it is a good movie. There's a lot of great qualities about the film that I really, really did enjoy, that I thought that Peter Hyams had done a really good job in directing the characters and directing the action, I'd say, and really telling a character story in such a heightened reality where it's hard to balance that out quite well. And I think he's one of the very few directors in the action genre that can do that beautifully, in my opinion. So a lot of credit to him. So for me, that'll be the end of my positive, because I can go on for hours about what else I love about the movie, but let's stop there and let's get into my negatives. The only real negative that I can point out about the film that I really wish we had more time on, because I'm going to say it right now before I go any further with this negative I'm going to point out, is that this is not a perfect film, as I mentioned before. So there's a lot of issues with this movie that are there, but quite frankly, for me, the positives outweigh the negatives by a long, long mile. But if there is one major negative that I can point out here that I wish we'd had more time on, is actually with the relationship between McCord and his ex-wife, because when you see in the beginning of the movie that she clearly does not like the guy anymore, and she is very angry that he just shows up unannounced and wants to hang out with the kids and take them out, she's very strict about and very hard on him about, we have a schedule and you should abide by a schedule, not just show up whenever you feel like it. And when you see how that's handled in the very beginning of the movie, you understand where the relationship's at that point. But then when the film ends, I actually would have liked to have seen how the events occurred after McCord had saved his kids and saved everybody at the Civic Arena, and see how the ex-wife reacts to that. Like, okay, I can see that, I may have been a little too hard on you, and yeah, let's just try to make this work out. Maybe not to get back together because she's already with another man, but rather to try to rekindle some part of the relationship that they can be maybe friends or be cordial, whatever the case may be. Because I actually would like to see how that would have been handled after everything that occurred here. And I would have liked to see that have a proper closure in that respect. But I understand that there's a possibility that maybe it was not as important to focus on that part of the story there, because we already know what it was like for him as far as how the setup is concerned with that relationship. And we can only assume that after he saved his kids and saved everybody else too, that maybe the ex-wife will come around and say, okay, it's cool, come by whenever you want. We can make that assumption there I would say to a degree. But as far as that's concerned, like I said before, I have some other negatives, but honestly, I don't feel like getting into that because I had a blast with this movie, and I think this film is that good that, as I said before, the positives outweigh the negatives by a long mile. So with that being said, let's get into my rating. So I love this film. I think, like I said before, this is easily one of Van Damme's best movies. It's in my top 5 as far as my favorite Van Damme films are concerned. And I will say too that if you look at this movie and you are making that comparison that this is pretty much a Die Hard ripoff, I get it. I'm not going to disagree with you entirely, but it's clearly obvious that it is. But the fact of the matter is that this is still a very strong story with great performances, a great director, and just a really good film altogether. So I hope you guys will go out of your way to check out the film if you haven't done so. Or if you have seen the movie a long time ago and didn't like it, I would highly recommend you go back and watch the film again, because it really is that strong of a movie in my opinion. So for me, I would give this movie a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. If you have seen this movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to the NRW, share, like our videos, and also hit the notification bell while you're down there as well. Also follow NRW on social media, on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, on Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. And you can follow me on my social media accounts, on Instagram and Twitter, Mr. Rob Medina, and on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And I have a show on the channel called You're So Cool with Rob Medina, and I have social media for the show as well. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina, and on Twitter, You're So Cool WRM. I hope you guys had a wonderful 2022, and I hope you have a great Happy New Year's, and let's hope for the best in 2023. So until next time, everybody, stay safe out there, and cheers.